I'm Terry Goodman, and I work in the Youth Services Center, and I have the good fortune to work with Melissa through some community coalitions. And I'd like to introduce Melissa Phillips. She works for the Health Department, and she is the Harm Reduction Specialist.
Got it.
Did I get that right?
You did.
Well, she wears a lot of hats, and every time I need something, I know I can call her. So she's very knowledgeable, and she's here to share some of that with you all tonight. So thank you again for being here.
I've done several different versions of this program depending on who I'm talking to. So this one is specifically for parents. So when we talk about e-cigarettes, there's actually been 4 different generations. And I'm gonna walk you through what they've looked like. And actually the products that I have with me have been confiscated from students. So I know kids have these items. So when they first came out, they were disposable, and they very much look like a cigarette. They actually called them Ciga-likes because in shape and function, they were very similar to the traditional cigarette. So once the nicotine in this device is gone, I throw it away. So disposable in the first generation. What they moved to next was refillable models. So this gave me a little bit of versatility. Now I can choose the flavor, I can fill it up myself, and I can recharge it. So now this is a reusable device. By the 3rd generation, they've gotten bigger, and we call these tanks or mods. Mods for modified, because I can customize this device. Now, when I say customize, I mean top to bottom. I can change the strength of my battery, I can change my drip tip, I can change my flavors, and these are also chargeable. So again, I can use this device over and over again. And then what we're seeing now, this latest generation, is the pod-based vapes. And now that nicotine is in a little bitty cartridge. Some of them are what we call closed pods, like the Joule. They're not refillable, but some of them are open pods, and you can put in your own liquid. So when we're talking to kids about e-cigarettes, we've got to be able to talk their talk. Because if I say e-cigarette, I'm going to get a blank stare from kids. That's not the language they use. So I did put up some of the words that you're going to hear them use. They're going to call them vapes. They're going to call them Joules. Even if they're not talking about that specific brand, they use it as a generic term. Mods, talking about the tanks. E-juice is that liquid that goes into the vapes. Pods or carts, which is short for cartridges for the pod-based vapes. And then any guesses what an analog is? Have you ever heard that term? That's the first gen. That's old-fashioned to a kid, so they call it an analog. Even though they're popping back up, like this one was confiscated from a kid about a month ago. So they're popping back up in their use. Now, of course, when they figured out e-cigarettes, they figured out e-everything else. So that's an example of an e-pipe, e-cigars, and the bottom one we're going to talk about a little bit later. That is an e-joint or a dab pen, a little bit different animal. So when we look at what's in them, there's a few basic ingredients they all have in common. You've got to have something that makes the cloud. Okay, so that's the propylene glycol or the vegetable glycerin. Your vapors are going to call that PG or VG. There's some level of nicotine in all these devices. Even if it says 0 on the label, if you test it, there's some level of nicotine. And then there's the chemicals that create the flavors. But if you dig a little bit deeper, this is what we also see. Some of the chemicals in these devices are carcinogenic. That means they cause cancer. Because some of these batteries heat to such a high degree, they can release fine metal particles, silicates, and nicotine particles that are big enough to be inhaled by the bystander. And that VOC, that volatile organic compound, When these batteries heat some of these chemicals, they change, okay? So some of these chemicals actually can be altered from heating. And we have to consider these tobacco products because if it has nicotine in it, the only place we get nicotine from is the tobacco leaf. So thus, we classify them with all of their tobacco products. And then even though these devices have been around for about a decade now, I still get the, well, it's just water vapor, what's the big deal argument. When you think about what's coming off of these devices, there's actually no water in these products at all. Think of it as a big chemical cloud. When I talk to kids, I talk about spraying aerosol hairspray and how it kind of hangs in the air for a little while. That's exactly what you're seeing with these devices. So we need to retrain ourselves to go from vapor to aerosol. And actually, it was the tobacco industry that taught us to call it vaping. They're the ones that came up with that terminology. So what do we know about what they do to our bodies? Well, since I have done this slide, up until this point, we had no long-term studies. Like I said, they've only been around about a decade, so long-term we do not know. But since that time, there's been one study. And what they have found is the effects are very similar to the traditional cigarette, but it happens much faster. Usually within about 3 years, you're gonna see some lung effects. In kids, we know no matter how they get that nicotine, it interferes with that developing brain. And we also know that it hardwires them to be more likely to be addicted to other substances. And then you've heard in the news, although it's died down a little bit, about all the pulmonary illnesses. There's actually been several different ones that have been linked to e-cigarettes. That lipoid pneumonia was the first. And then the popcorn lung, which was linked to a certain chemical called diacetyl, which they originally found in workers who work in microwave popcorn factories. And that butter flavor, that chemical, was giving them this disease that kind of looks like COPD. And we're also seeing that with the vapes. And then the newest is the EVALI, and that's the one where we've been seeing the deaths recorded over the last several months. And then what you need to realize with these products is there is no quality control. If you look on one of these devices, there's no list of ingredients. There is no body saying they have to tell you what is in them, which is pretty scary to me. Especially when we're talking about kids, they don't know what they're inhaling into their lungs. So from device to device, from flavor to flavor, there's no consistency because there's no agency telling them that they have to. And what we have found is some brands are more dangerous than others and certain flavors are worse than others. When you talk about flavors, at the top would probably be vanilla, butter, popcorn, because of that diacetyl I mentioned. Any of your fruit flavors. So anything with that diacetyl chemical, but we don't know because it's not labeled on the package. And then that chemical that makes the cloud is irritating to some people, the eyes, the nose, the throat. And I have found personally as a bystander, when I'm around somebody who's vaping, I can feel it burning in my throat, just as a bystander. Which brings us to secondhand aerosol. You know, we've heard for years and years the dangers of secondhand smoke, and we know the links to health harms. We don't have that same research on secondhand aerosol at this point. And then again, no matter what form it comes in, nicotine has adverse effects on a pregnant woman and that developing baby. So it's scary to me when we have our pregnant clients who say, well, I was smoking, but now while I'm pregnant, I've switched to vaping. So a little bit of data on kids. We've done a really good job teaching our kids that cigarettes are bad. Our youth smoking rates are very low, and that's a good thing. But for the first time ever, More kids are vaping than using any other form of tobacco. And then from 2017 to 2018, look at what our vaping numbers did. Anybody know what product hit the market in 2017? The Joule. Okay? When the Joule hit the market, the vaping numbers with youth skyrocketed. When we do the surveys at school with kids and we ask those tobacco questions, the majority of them do not realize that the vapes have nicotine in them. Okay? So they do not even realize they're potentially addictive. So our worry is that these vapes are going to become a bridge to traditional cigarettes, and the research is supporting that. So what gets them to start vaping? It's the flavors. It's those same surveys we do when we ask them, why would you be willing to try a vape? They're curious about the flavors because there's thousands and thousands of options. Now, these are not things that would appeal to an adult. So we know they're directly marketing to kids. The one that really bothers me is the one that comes in a juice box. Am I going to go buy apple juice shaped vape juice? No. But would my 14-year-old kid, would that appeal to them? Absolutely. So you can see they've played off of liquor labels. They've done things like gummy bears. Everybody usually likes the unicorn barf. Again, does that appeal to an adult? And I have one that was confiscated from a kiddo. The flavor is almost famous. What does that taste like? But would that be appealing to a kid? Well, it must have been because a kid had this one at school. So we know the kiddos are using flavors. That number is probably not even accurate at this point. It's probably closer to 90%. And the fruit and the candy are the top picks. But menthol is also really high for kids. Anybody know why menthol is so appealing to people? What does it do? It does. It's cooling, okay? So it takes that harshness away no matter what type of tobacco it is. So when we talk to our educators, we know this is a really challenging area. About a fifth of our kids will tell you they see them at school every single day. They're easy to hide. So I wish all my kids would cover their eyes because I don't want to give them any ideas here. But this was confiscated from a school. Can you see the vape in the picture? So they've taken that magic marker that they're allowed to have at school, hollowed it out, slid their Joule inside. Now I'm using my Joule in class and my teacher doesn't know. Because the products are constantly changing, sometimes teachers don't know what they have. And all the schools that about a decade ago spent big money to put smoke detectors in the bathrooms, they don't pick up the aerosol. So they can use these in the bathrooms and nobody will know. And then disturbingly, this is an industry for kids. This is a way for them to make money. They are selling devices, they are selling pods, or they'll even sell hits off their own device. Okay? So this has become an industry and it's happening right during the school day. And we can't have this discussion without talking about Joule, because even though they have faced a lot of controversy in the last year or so, they are still the industry leader. Kids love the design. These were designed by a couple of kids from Stanford. They were engineering students. And it was actually kind of brilliant what they did, because they took this big, heavy, clunky device and completely stripped it down. Made it look very tech, made it look like something maybe Apple would come up with. Okay? Very appealing to kids, very easy to hide because of its size. And if you're not familiar with Joule, this is its charger, okay? This tiny little device. So I pop this on my Joule, I plug it into a USB. If my parent or my educator doesn't know what I have, is that very easy to hide? Absolutely. So what we have found is schools that issue Chromebooks, they could be charging their device right there in the classroom. Now, Joule will tell you that 1 pod equals about a pack of cigarettes. I'm going to show you in a minute that that's baloney. But what they also did is they developed their own nicotine formula. And it's called a nicotine salt. It's much more powerful, much more concentrated, but that harshness we talked about when you take a hit, they took that away. So very appealing to kids. Now this is most people's favorite part of the thing. I have a few new examples of what the industry has done. And again, I hope you come away with this thinking they are not marketing to adults, they are absolutely marketing to kids. Because now vapes do not look like vapes. What does that remind you of? Looks like a key fob, right? It's a vape. I don't have the cartridge with me, but I actually have one. It's even got the push button like some keys do, but when you push the button, you screw on your cartridge and you have your vape. So my kid who's driving could have this hanging from their keychain, could have it hanging from a lanyard. I don't realize what they've got. These look like cute little sparkly handbags. Looks like an Apple Watch, right? Or maybe one of the bigger fitness devices. It actually functions like a watch, but when I push the button, well, if it works like it's supposed to, here's my vape. Okay? So my cartridge is here at the top. There's my mouthpiece. Okay? So, tells time, the whole shebang. But it's a vape they're wearing right there on their wrist. Those are not inhalers, folks. Those are vapes. And then these are actually designed to be vapes that also function as travel cups, but a lot of kids have figured out how to MacGyver their own travel cups and just attach the straw to the vape. And then I didn't even know these existed till one of my high schools confiscated one of these. This is a functioning Bluetooth speaker that is actually a vape. Okay. So, designed for adults? I say no. And then this one usually blows people's mind. Regular hoodie, right? Just basic gray hoodie. This is a new industry called vapewear. Because what you don't see is this little hidden pocket right here. And one string attaches to my vape. Tuck it in its little pocket. And I use the other one as a mouthpiece. Okay. So if you want to see what's out there, Google vapewear. It's a whole industry. Again, an adult's not going to need this because it's legal for an adult to be doing. And the question did come up before everybody got sat down. Do you know what age is the legal age in Kentucky to use these products? It's 18, but nationally they just passed a law that raised it to 21. So Kentucky should be following suit soon, but for any tobacco product now at the national level, the age to purchase is 21. Now what about internet? There's no enforcement built in yet, so there's a loophole. So for my visual folks, and this is just the pod-based vapes, I wanted to give you an idea of how much nicotine kids are consuming. So we know there's about 20 cigarettes in a pack of cigarettes. So if you look at a Joule, each one of those pods is about equivalent to 2 packs of cigarettes. And we hear of kids doing 2, 3, 4 pods a day. Okay, so think about how much nicotine they're consuming. I don't have a fix in my collection, but they're even worse. And probably the worst in the game is Soren. Look how many cigarettes is one equivalent to one pod. So again, these kids who are doing multiple pods are consuming massive amounts of nicotine. And then I call this part the unintended consequences. I really don't think they thought this through. But the calls to poison control climb every single year. And this is exposures to that liquid nicotine. And most of it is our little bitties. So you can see half of them were under the age of 5. And then about a third of our kids, those surveys I mentioned, will admit to vaping THC. So not only are they vaping nicotine, some of our kids are also vaping THC. And then if you've ever Googled e-cig explosions, that is a real thing. This is one of the more recent ones. This was a teenager in Nevada. His device exploded in his mouth. You can see he lost teeth, gums, jawbone, extensive oral damage. So what about when they do vape other substances? Probably the most common one we're facing is when they vape THC. This is a dab pen that was confiscated from a youth. Looks very similar to an e-cigarette, right? And sometimes they just put that THC into their regular vaping device. But there is products made specifically for dabbing. There's no pot smell with these, so you don't know if it's nicotine or THC. And depending on the device will depend on what kind they use. Most of the time with kids, it's going to be the oils. But what the data is starting to tell us is when you vaporize THC, the high is much stronger than if you smoke it. And then the other one, not as popular but does happen, is vaporizing alcohol. So this is an actual device that they sell to do that, but again, you can MacGyver your own device, but you have to heat up the alcohol to get it to that vapor state. This is incredibly dangerous. There's a very high risk of alcohol poisoning. There have been devices on the market that have been outlawed. This is so dangerous. When you vaporize alcohol, you lose some of the drunk sensations. I think that's why it's so popular. And especially with our females, they think they're not consuming calories if they vaporize it. But what they don't realize is when you vaporize alcohol, it's not being processed by your liver like it would be when you drink it. It's going directly into your bloodstream. So it's very, very dangerous. So how do I know? What are some red flags that my kid could be vaping? So I have just a short list here. Secrecy. Have they suddenly decided they do not want you touching their backpack? They don't want you in their room. They're very particular about their belongings. They could have something they don't want you to see. Money. They suddenly cannot account for where their birthday money went, where that Christmas money went. Because my big warning here is Visa gift cards. Wonderful idea in theory. The person can get whatever they want. They can go wherever they want. But a teenager with a Visa gift card on the internet can also get whatever they want. So they can go to these vaping sites and buy their devices. I personally know somebody whose child did that. So maybe give them cash instead. The increased thirst has to do with the chemicals that make the cloud. They lead to dry mouth. So if they're just drinking, could be a red flag. The changes in mood would have to do with nicotine withdrawal. You know, if this is a kid that's now addicted to their source of nicotine and they can't get it as frequently as their body says they need it, they could be very crabby. Okay, so if they're very irritable with you, very short, very mouthy, could be a red flag. I have had so many people tell me, well, these things smell so good. Well, if that smell is in your car and you don't have an air freshener, red flag. A lot of times, to me, it's a very chemically smell that kind of burns your nose. So if you're smelling that in their bedroom, could be red flag. Okay. So a lot of these are very subtle. And then, especially with our high schoolers, wearing the inappropriate clothing, because the pod-based vapes don't make the huge clouds like the tank did. Okay? So it's not this huge aerosol. So it's very easy for me to exhale into a sleeve or exhale down into my neckline if I'm wearing one of those big hoodies. But if it's 90 degrees outside, is that appropriate clothing? Okay? So just a few red flags. Hey, my kid could be using these devices. So I wanted to do short and sweet to give you guys something to think about and maybe have some time for questions. So anything you've heard on the news? I have not personally dealt with these kids, but I have been told as young as 4th grade that they're finding these in the school. Yeah. So not only do our middle schools having to come up with policy, now our elementary schools are having to come up with policy. Yes, ma'am.
Are there any tests on the market that parents can use to like drug test their kids to see if they're vaping?
That is a real challenge even for our school resource officers. It's being developed. A couple of weeks ago, I heard of something that's available to law enforcement so they can test on site. Usually they have to take these devices and send them to labs. Because like I said, there's no smell, it looks the same, so you don't know, is it nicotine, is it THC? Any other questions?
Is this a video that's going to be available to pull up?
Yeah, HCEC-TV is filming this, so it should be available on their website at some point. So yeah, if you want to go back and show, and I did another video with them on their HCS Matters show. That's about 45 minutes long. That's a little more comprehensive. I know they wanted this one to be shorter. If you want to go look that one up. Anything else? Again, like I said, there's resources out there that are geared towards parents. You know, one of them is, how do I have that conversation with my kiddo? There's some on vaping THC, if you want to look at those. So I thank you guys for having me.